Hi everyone, my name's Lorenza and I'm going to talk through some tips and tricks when you're, say, blending between pattern sizes on commercial patterns. So say if you'd cut out a 12 as I did in this one and it was a bit tight or it was a bit too big and you wanted to just bring in the pattern a little bit or make it a little bit wider. So first things first is before you do any pattern alterations, you should always draw in your stitch line. Now I have drawn this in here in red because your stitch line is where you will be stitching the garment together, as opposed to the outside line here of the 12 that I'm pointing out. That is the cut line. So that's when we're cutting out the garment. So you should always do that before you do any pattern alterations. Reason being is because when you're joining up pattern pieces, you're joining up the cut line. You're not joining, you're joining up the stitch line, not the cut line. So for example, if I've got there's the back overlay and here's the front, and I'll just do the dart on this one. So prove the dart so you can see where the back and the front joins up. Now I know when you lay it together you think, oh, well that matches up, but we should always be matching up the stitch line, not necessarily the cut line. So always do that before you do any alterations to patterns, just so when you're proving all your seams and your darts and everything, it works. Now I know I'm often like, oh, I'll just quicken line a bit off and just be lazy with it, but please trust me when you always need to do it. But for the tips and tricks for this tutorial, I won't actually be drawing on the stitch lines. I'm just going to go through some tips and tricks. So with this pattern, this is a back overlay, so it was a lace overlay on a top. I've got the back and the front here actually. So I just wanted to show on this one, that was the stitch line. That was sort of the purpose of that pattern piece. So we have the back here. So when I made this top, it was a bit tight when I sat down on my ribs or sort of my tummy when I sat down. So I cut it out in the 12 and I needed to extend it back out to a 14. Now, silly me, of course, I just thought, well, I'll just bring it out here and add on, say, a centimetre to make it the 14 again. So let's just imagine I added in a bit there. But of course, I didn't add anything to the sleeve. So when I went to sew the sleeve on, of course, it didn't fit. So that would be my absolute top trick or suggestion whenever you're making any changes to patterns, whatever you're doing to one side. So this is the side seam of the back. Always also do it to the side seam of your front, because these two will be matching up. So once that dart is sewn, so I'll just pin this again. So if you're doing any changes to a seam, think, where is that seam matching up? Because you've got to do the exact same change to the other side. So again, please draw in your stitch lines and do the alterations to them first, but I'm just showing you here for the sake of it. So this is the front pattern piece and this is the back. So if I was added on a bit of extra to make it a 14, add it on to your front pattern piece as well, because they will be joining up. But the mistake I made was rather than I didn't alter anything on the sleeve, so I thought I'd just bring the sleeve in here. Because obviously when I added in that little bit to make it a 14, that is bringing out the armhole. So you can see there, and of course this was still cut out in the 12, so that needed to come out to the 14 as well. Because if you think about it, this is the armhole of the sleeve, and when that joins on, there's where your notches match up. Of course, if this came out to the 14 and then the sleeve didn't, so the sleeve isn't going to fit. So think about when you do alterations, think, where is this seam matching up everywhere else on my pattern? Because you will need to make those alterations to everywhere else you're making any alterations to. You've got to make those changes to everywhere that seam or those stitch lines are meeting up with other pattern pieces. So literally just one line here that impacts the front, and that definitely impacts the sleeve. So really think before you start altering things. So the question I was asked though, like say if you're just going from a 12 to a 14, so I'll just draw in the 12 here. And if this was like a curve on a dress, I'd just be using a French curve to add in a curve. So say if it's shaped in around the waist, I'd just get the French curve to go from a 12 to a 10 or to a 12 to a 14, whatever it is you're wanting to do. But for the sake of this, let's say I wanted to keep it at the 12 because it did fit me there. I would then just bring this out. I think this looks about a centimetre. I've got about a centimetre there. So it is easy as you're just adding. So I'm going to keep the underarm around the 12 and bring it out to the 14, because this top fit me really well. It was just too tight around here, as I said, when I sat down, because it's kind of like a cropped top. So in the end, this was the adjustment I did. So I literally blended from a 12 to a 14 there. So it is literally that simple if you want to do it. If you wanted to make a 14 the whole way around, obviously we're going to be doing, you'd be needing to add that to the front as well and to the sleeve. But when I'm just blending it from a 12 to 14 here, I'd only need to do that on the front as well. So obviously you need to close that dart, and then I'd be doing the same thing and drawing it in and just giving that little extra space there. So that is what you just need to keep in mind when you're doing any kind of alterations. Always use your rulers, always use your French curves. If say it was a waist and it curved in, let me just draw something else. Say if it curved in and then went back out, and depending on what your hips are like, wherever you need to add it in, just use your French curve to draw in those nice curves. And you can just use the French curve to blend between the sizes. So you can make those curves and those blends, those shapes, anything so it suits your shape. But just remember, any change you're doing on any particular seam or stitch line, think, where is that pattern piece joining up to all my other pattern pieces, because you'll need to make those changes as well. So they're just some tips and suggestions for when you are doing any sort of pattern alterations. So think about those seams. Don't forget the arm like I did that time, because you'll go to sew on your next piece and think, why doesn't this match up? So yeah, always to begin with, like I said, draw in those stitch lines, as annoying as it is, but this is a 1.5 centimeter stitch line, so you can see how much smaller this pattern becomes when you draw that in. Then do your pattern alterations. Then yes, you're going to have to add those seam allowances back on again. So always do that. Always just trace everything off onto a fresh piece of paper like this. Because trying to work with these tissue patterns and drawing and cutting into them and pinning them, they're tissue paper, so they do just really start falling apart. So always trace off your patterns onto this paper. If you want to know how to trace off patterns, I've got reels on that as well. But trace off, and then you can do all your blending and your drawing, you're adding your seam allowances and your alterations to your patterns. You can make a mock-up again, and then you can always come back to that paper pattern. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight for if you're scared of blending between like a 10 and a 12 or a 14 or any kind of pattern. It really is that easy. Just use your rulers, your French curves, and if you make one change, think, where does that seam intersect with all my other pattern pieces, because you'll need to make those changes. And always bring over all of your notches as well. That's it. Thanks for listening. Bye.